Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters and friends. Does science lead to atheism? No, it doesn't. Full stop. And let me explain to you why. If anyone studies the philosophy of science, they will come to the conclusion that science does not lead to a rejection of the divine. Why am I saying this? The first thing to understand is the limitations of science. One of the limits of science is that at any moment, scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. This is exactly what Elliot Sober, a philosopher of science, in his essay Empiricism said, and he's actually an atheist, that scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. Now, these can include direct observations or indirect observations. The point here is that science deals with contingent phenomena. It deals with phenomena that you can observe in some way. But God, by definition, cannot be observed in any way from the point of view that he is some kind of contingent thing. He doesn't have limited physical qualities. Rather, especially in the Islamic tradition, God is a necessary being, which within that includes that God doesn't have limited physical qualities. Science can only deal with contingent realities, not necessary realities. Things that are necessary, things that are not contingent. This is very important to understand. Another thing that you have to understand in the philosophy of science is that for a scientific conclusion to be considered scientific, it cannot refer to divine power or to divine wisdom or to divine creativity. This is called methodological naturalism. So scientific conclusions are restricted in that way, that for anything to be scientific, it cannot refer to divine power, creativity, or wisdom. This doesn't mean, though, that God doesn't exist. And this is something very important for us to understand. It is a methodological constraint. It's basically saying, well, for scientific conclusions to be considered scientific, they cannot refer to any divine creative power. This doesn't now mean that God doesn't exist. It just says this is what a scientific conclusion is. It is a conclusion that doesn't refer to divine creative power, wisdom, etc. This is methodological naturalism. And generally speaking, scientific conclusions adhere to methodological naturalism. Now, this is different from saying that God doesn't exist. This would be philosophical naturalism. And philosophical naturalism is the worldview that there is no divine, there is no God, there is no supernatural, and everything can be explained by physical processes. This is a philosophical position. It's a metaphysic, if you like. It's a first principle. It's the lenses that people put on their eyes, some people put on their eyes, in order to understand reality. So they negate God from the beginning. This is philosophical naturalism, and it's fundamentally different from methodological naturalism. So when someone says science does lead to atheism, they are conflating methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism. Those two things are fundamentally different. One is a constraint, it's a methodological constraint to understand what scientific conclusions are, and the other one is a worldview, a philosophy, a way of seeing the world. One negates God, the other doesn't negate God. It just says, in order for a particular conclusion to be scientific, it can't refer to God. Those two things are fundamentally different. And that's why people who claim that science leads to atheism conflate methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism. So from this point of view, science does not lead to atheism. Now, one would argue, hold on a second, do not some scientists or philosophers use science to formulate an argument to reject God's existence? Yes, maybe they do. But that is not a scientific conclusion anymore. It's called an evidential argument. An evidential argument is not a scientific conclusion. It is a philosophical argument that uses some scientific data and tries to philosophize over that data to come to a conclusion that denies God, that denies the divine. It is not a scientific conclusion though, it's an evidential argument. And that's why when some people try and squeeze in or sneak in from the back a scientific argument to reject God, then in reality it's not a scientific argument, it's just scientific data that philosophers or thinkers or scientists use to philosophize over in order to try and form the atheistic conclusions. But that is not a scientific conclusion, it would be called an evidential argument, which is a philosophical argument. So from this point of view, you have to understand that science is relatively neutral from that perspective. It loosely adheres to methodological naturalism, which basically says for any scientific conclusion to be considered scientific, it cannot refer to divine creative power. And likewise, you can't use that conclusion to directly affirm the divine, or even to directly reject the divine. So to answer the question, does science lead to atheism? Of course it doesn't, by virtue of what we've just discussed. However, theists, people who believe in God, people who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, could look at the observable universe and to philosophize over what they observe to make the conclusions that are true. In other words, that God does exist and that He is worthy of glorification and worthy of praise and worthy of worship. Of course we can. But in order for something to be scientific, then you can't refer to any divine creative power from the point of view of methodological naturalism. And this is why scientific conclusions can't directly affirm and they cannot directly reject God's existence. If you're going to use some scientific data to disprove God, that doesn't become a scientific conclusion anymore, it's an evidential argument. And if you're going to use some scientific data to prove God's existence, that's still not a scientific argument, it becomes a theistic argument for God's existence that is fundamentally philosophical. So from this perspective, science does not lead to atheism by virtue of what we've just said.